Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Hajo Eicken. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Arctic Observing Summit 2020. I'm joined here by the other members of the Executive Organizing Committee and the working group leads and working group representatives. We're happy to have you here for the final session of the summit. I'd like to get started by just briefly sharing the agenda for today, so we have a rough perspective on what we're hoping to accomplish. We've laid this out as a 2-hour session. We're going to be starting off with a synthesis and summary from the different working groups that's moderated by Eva Kruemmel with Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada. Then we are looking forward to remarks and perspectives from Iceland's Minister of Education, Science and Culture, Lilja Alfređsdóttir, and we will have an opportunity to also have a brief question and answer session with her, in particular about the links between the Arctic Observing Summit and the third Arctic Science Ministerial. And then we'll move into the last part of today's agenda with a brief review of the key findings and recommendations from this Arctic Observing Summit. So we'll have a chance to jointly review that document. I'll be sharing that on the screen. And then we will furthermore review the next step in concluding this summit and follow-up work and ways in which you can stay engaged and be part of the broader process. So with that, I would like to hand things off to Eva Kruemmel, who's a Senior Policy Advisor on Environment and Health with the Circumpolar Council Canada. She's also representing ICC as a board member of the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative and is on the Science Advisory Board for the third Arctic Science Ministerial. Eva, if you would like to lead the next part of the session.
Yes, thank you very much, Hajo. Hello, good morning, good day, good evening, good night, depending on where you are. I hope everybody is doing well. I'm reading you from Madawaska Valley, which is located on the traditional territory and homeland of the Algonquin First Nations in Ontario, Canada. So this is the last session of the AOS, and we will now move forward to the final report of the working group, each of which will give a very brief summary of their work, which was done over the last 2 days. And we had very good participation. There were, I think, 90 people in the first session of the AOS that I attended, and then 40 to 50 in pretty much every working group session that I participated in. And we are over 100 participants now. So I think that's a very great success. So now I'm going to share my screen. I'll first put this. We'll have the presentations now. See, and probably have to do it this way. We'll see here. And see if I can get that in presentation mode. Okay, so we'll be starting in order with all of the working groups, and we'll hear from working group 1 first. Each group has about 2 slides with a very brief summary. And if working group 1 can go ahead with their presentation.
Yes, I can absolutely go ahead, but the slides disappeared from the screen share.
Eva, it's a gray screen.
Here. That's weird. Let me see. It says it's paused. Okay.
If we're presenting from Google Slides, you have to do, rather than just the window, you need to do the full desktop.
Okay. Let me try that again.
Yeah, Eva, if you want me to, I have them up on my computer.
Sure, then
let me know.
Go ahead. That might be easier. Thanks, Alan.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So Working Group 1 has had several very successful sessions over the last couple of days and come to a number of points that we would like to highlight. We've got lengthy notes that'll go into the final report, but the real highlights are that we want to first acknowledge that global networks are doing a lot of really good work, and especially should emphasize that their efforts extended into the Arctic would be a really valuable contribution. But that the Arctic observing system and the key outcomes of roads that we've been talking about, the real value here is going to be in cross-sector information and requirements sharing. So we're proposing that essential Arctic variables be shared Arctic variables. In order to define these, we recommend that the roads process through SEON convene expert panels to define these essential Arctic variables, their measurement standards, and then any grouped variable or any grouped observations that be made together. And that these groups should be broadly inclusive and include rounds of community comment to best reflect a full range of perspectives. And finally, that Arctic Indigenous community collaboration throughout the process, including participation with the Food Security Working Group, is going to be really critical for further success. Alan, if you could go to the next slide, please. And so ultimately, we have come to the understanding that an essential or shared Arctic variable needs to be both very important and important to multiple sectors and stakeholder groups. So we've come up with a number of potential criteria for essential Arctic variables, or these shared Arctic variables, that they can have that they should have at least one of either predictive potential or forecasting ability, local or meet local and regional information needs, especially with regards to impact and decision making and planning, and that they should be representative of key elements, or that they should be representative of key elements of the Arctic social environmental system. And finally, a point that has come out of a lot of discussions crossing over with Working Group 3 is that essential Arctic variables should be reflective of context, and that bundled observations or kind of recommended groups of observations should be made together, recognizing that we live and work in a very interdisciplinary world and that no process exists in isolation. The context is critically important to this information. So these are the key takeaways. Again, we have a lot of other additional information that will be going into the full meeting report, but this is our key recommendations going forward with the roads process.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Alice. That was great, very succinct. Can we now move to Working Group 2, please?
Good morning, everybody. This is Maribeth Murray, and I'll be reporting on behalf of our working group. I think you'll find many of our recommendations about EAVs are similar to Working Group 2. We framed our discussions this week in the context of adaptation and mitigation, and we kind of focused on 3 areas that allowed us to get to our assessment of what makes an impactful EAV. And those were land cover change, disaster risk reduction and emergency management, and human health and food security. And as with Working Group 1, we feel that an impactful essential Arctic variable should have multiple uses. It should be applicable on a pan-Arctic or multi-regional scale, as well as on a local scale. It should have an outsized influence on ecosystem, environment, and communities. It should be cost effective, and by cost effective, we're not simply talking about monetary, but we mean it should have the broadest possible applications to different groups and organizations and for different sorts of problem solving. And it should be something that we have the ability to observe and to access relevant output quickly and easily. And one or more of these should be taken into consideration when defining a variable. The second thing that we would like to point out, which I guess is also similar to Working Group 1, is that there are a number of needs that need to be filled quickly to support scaling up of observations to support adaptation and mitigation, and particularly in the short and medium term. And finally, we feel there's a strong opportunity here now to fill gaps and build consensus around the societal benefit areas, and that the EAVs should be used to help define priorities for observation. Next slide, please. Further recommendations from our group are that the existing global monitoring and observing initiatives can and should be leveraged to support adaptation and mitigation, including specifically risk reduction and emergency management. The successful use of observing partnerships, and we define these broadly, but clearly this includes partnerships with Indigenous people, communities, and organizations, as well as the private sector, government, non-governmental agencies, and so on, are necessary. We need to have an inclusive participatory process that weaves Indigenous and local expertise with scientific knowledge. And finally, our group would like to point out that there's often a poor link or significant time lag between observing activities and their output and the actions that need to be informed by observation, such as policy development, implementation of solutions and strategies for adaptation and mitigation. And so we would like to see some well-defined mechanisms or governance processes that can act as a catalyst to shorten the process. And we feel that SAON has a role to play here, as well as other types of bridging organizations. And I think I'll leave it at that. We'll have quite a lot of detail that we put forward to go into the final report as well.
Thank you very much, Maribeth. Now we'll move on to Working Group 3.
Thanks. I'm Margaret Rudolph, a Inupiat from King Island, Alaska, and a PhD student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you wanted to go to my slide. Thank you. So these are, I'm honored to present these recommendations put forth by the Food Security Working Group. They are just a portion of the 11 themes we developed and will be available after the conference. I wanted to applaud the hard work of our planning committee and thank all the participants involved. And if you go to the next slide. Thank you. These are recommended actions under the key themes presented in the previous slide. The recommendations put forth on viewing the food security through Indigenous lens is because Indigenous peoples have different perspective on what an ecosystem approach is than was being typically applied. And also the process needs to be inclusive to diverse perspectives from a whole community, from hunters to youth. The recommendations put forth under weaving human health and wellness into every aspect of observation system is one aspect of viewing food security through an Indigenous lens. Indigenous perspectives take a holistic approach about the ecosystem health, means in relation to serious threats of pollution, such as contaminants and plastics, human health, human and animal diseases, mental wellness, and degradation of the overall ecosystem. We are recommending moving away from community-based monitoring to community-driven research and monitoring. There's immediate need to support ongoing and expand community-driven efforts across Alaska, which facilitate individuals to observe and monitor on the ground year-round, as opposed to only work done seasonally by external researchers. We're asking to increase capacity for Indigenous peoples and communities to achieve community-driven monitoring. This means empowering and including Indigenous leadership and Indigenous and traditional knowledge holders. We're also asking to increase support for capacity building with researchers so that way they can understand the Indigenous lens. Something that we've heard throughout the conference as well as within our own committee is how COVID-19 has been a major disruption to both the researchers' lives as well as the Indigenous communities. We recommend taking the opportunity to look at what's working, what's not working, and how we can move forward differently. We encourage everyone to use this time as an opportunity to reflect upon and build on our collective relationships, particularly on relationships with Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Margaret. Now we're moving on to Working Group 4.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for all for attending. My name is Peter Pulsfer. I'm going to report back on Working Group 4. We focused on data interoperability, federated search, and all things data and information. So there are two themes that we identified: overarching community building, social and organization dimensions, and then technical, which I'll speak to in the next slide. So the Arctic data community has been coming together for some years, and we are now well positioned to move to the next level of maturity and inclusiveness. So continued coordination and cooperation will be key in the coming years. We need to continue moving towards a co-production model where we're all at the same table, and this will give us the best possible chance of developing great solutions for the problems that we face. This can be achieved through focused, practical efforts that are guided by a larger vision. So really stay down close to the ground to ensure that we can make clear and practical progress. It requires that we consider all relevant protocols in our work, including protocols like the new CARE principles that focus on Indigenous data sovereignty, but also recognizing there'll be local protocols, and that can go right from the individual communities right on up to national, regional, and so on. We recognize that we do not exist outside of the global system, and so we must continue to engage with broader international initiatives so we don't create an Arctic silo. And lastly, education and training was seen as one of the key components that we need to really promote over the coming years. It's fundamental and it's really important for our ongoing success. Next slide, please. So on the technical side, and I've tried to keep this at a fairly high level, but we are developing a paper that will have the details here. But we find that we need a number of fundamental and foundational system components, and these include things like a map of the resources that are out there, the digital resources that are available to us, mechanisms for data discovery, shared vocabularies so that we can understand the information that's being shared, and then also stable and long-term repositories to ensure that the data and information that we collect are there for now and for future. The system will be distributed, or as we say sometimes, a system of systems. So we must ensure that these systems can connect, and at the technical and at the human level. So it's not just about technologies, but also things like policies, protocols, standards, etc. This is going to require the use of standards wherever appropriate and ethical. And we do need to consider that as we're going forward, that there are implications for adopting standards that we must carefully consider. Technology is rapidly evolving, as we all know. It's moving very, very quickly. And so as a community, not just the data community, but all of our users as well, we must pay attention to these developments, continue to evaluate and leverage wherever appropriate and valuable. And this includes things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud-based systems, and so on. And then the move towards model-based platform science. And lastly, I just want to make the point that we recognize that we must embrace the connection between the community writ large, including the data folks, but all of the others, and technology. So this is not just about the technologies, the computers, the data objects, but it's about all of us working together. And so that has to be fit into what we think of as a data ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll move on to Working Group 5.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jan René Larsen, and I'm the Secretary of SEAN. With Peter Schlosser and Thorstein Gunnarsson, I've been chairing Working Group 5, where we have been discussing Arctic observations in the context of global observing initiatives. And we have a number of findings and recommendations, which we've also seen from some of the other working groups, but we would like to present them to you here. I should start by explaining that we have had a group discussion this morning where some of the findings and recommendations have been refined, and the final versions will be found in the report to be the outcome of the meeting. Our findings, the first one is that even though that the Arctic is a hotspot for global change, then we note that Arctic observing systems are still lacking the coverage and continuity that are required to obtain a full picture for the nature and pace of the changes seen in all domains. And we also note that even though nations invest in observing, especially in lower latitudes, there is a gap compared to what would be expected to be observed in the Arctic. We would need Arctic observing systems to be synchronized with existing global observing systems, and that require more effort. We note that while global observing systems are often large and efficient, they are often driven by other motivations than what is appropriate for local stakeholders. They are more often driven by general objectives, such as climate change, which may not be sufficient for local for local needs. We also note that they are designed as grids, and that's not frequently not the most relevant approach to Arctic observations, that in the Arctic should be tailored to understanding processes. Finally, our finding is that social systems are generally poorly represented in observing systems, and this is especially true for global observing systems. We know that there are virtually no global systems for socioeconomic and sociocultural observations. Next slide, please. And our recommendations are that looking at the global observing systems, they should be expanded into the Arctic, at least with a subset of their parameters matching the essential variables that we would like to observe in the Arctic. And we also note that an Arctic observing system should cover all domains, but it should still use the single domain observations of the global observing systems when these are extended into the Arctic. And then we recommend that the proposed CN-ROACH process that will define Arctic essential variables should be established at a rapid pace. The ROACH process should use processes already established by the global observing systems for identifying and defining essential variables wherever possible. There's a lot of things that we can learn from the global systems that have been doing this for a long time. And this was my final slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan-René. So we'll open up for questions. If people who have any questions could post them in the Q&A box, and then I will read them out and see if the panelists can respond if there are any. I also would like to, while people are thinking about questions and putting them in the Q&A box, I would like to congratulate all the organizers for the running of the AOS this year. We had a lot of difficulties and challenges associated with the COVID-19, and I find it extremely impressive how quickly and smoothly everything was turned over to an online meeting, and how people stuck with it, even though it was really difficult for everybody. And it's really impressive, and I think it's a great success. So with that, are there any questions? I don't really see. Oh, there is one. Let me see. So Vito is asking for working group 4 about data ecosystems. The recommendation is that technology could always be at the service and not in the front, the need of research community. It's more a comment, he says. But maybe anybody from working group 4 wants to say about something about data ecosystems.
Yeah, thank you, Vito, for that comment. And certainly if there are others in the group online who'd like to comment, that's great. But I think what we just try and recognize there is that the data system is not strictly a technical system, that it has linkages, certainly technical linkages, but there are organizations involved, there are people involved, there are inputs and outputs, you know, there's evolution of the system and so on. So I can't go into too much depth. There's a lot of theory and discussion around that idea, but it just really the highest level point there is that it's interconnected. So it's not a single entity. It's not this monolithic thing that exists on some single server.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. I'm also seeing a comment in the chat from Hanne. Will you use both shared Arctic variables and essential Arctic variables? Will there be a different definition? Is there anybody who would like to take this on?
Sure. This is Alice from Working Group 1. In the discussions with Working Group 1, several of our thoughts have converged on the idea that an essential Arctic variable is a shared Arctic variable, and that where the strength in this system and this framework is in making those connections between sectors and between fields. So while something may be a very important variable to an individual group, the feature that makes it essential in the sense that it's worth a collaborative effort to organize around is the fact that it is shared and useful across these broader sector boundaries.
Thank you very much, Alice. I don't see any more questions right now. Are there any other thoughts or comments? Or there's actually one coming in now from Molly. Can you give an example of a shared Arctic variable? I guess it's also for Alice to answer, maybe.
Sure, we've had a number of examples come through, and this is where we think there's really a lot of room for expert panels and community input into the roads process to define, but concepts like sea ice cover or features of the ecosystem. I'm having a hard time coming up with really concrete examples, recognizing that there's still a lot of development process in how we find these definitions. But the idea being that it's variables and pieces of information that are valuable to multiple parts of the Arctic observing and user community. And yes, Hajo can complete that.
Well, as a thank you, if I may, as a member of Working Group 1, the example that we work through and going into more detail, what are the specific attributes of shared Arctic variables, how do they translate into specific requirements? The example we worked with was related to permafrost thaw. And in the case of permafrost thaw, we had both the classic definition of what is the thermal state of permafrost related to temperature, the thermal properties of the permafrost, which serves a number of different functions, both in terms of understanding release of greenhouse gases, stability of the permafrost, its relevance in the context of changing Arctic habitats. But at the same time, there's also a very strong interest and need for information from the perspective of threats to infrastructure and coastal erosion. And one of the challenges and you know, the next steps in working on this will be, how can we make sure that as different groups conduct observations of these shared variables, they meet the requirements not of their own narrow constituency, but of the broader sets of constituencies or data users as well. That's really where the strength of the SEAN roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems is going to come in. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Hajo and everybody. We have one more question, but maybe we can hold it because I think we'll be able to talk more later on, but I think we are now ready for the minister. So Hajo, I don't know if you're doing the introduction.
Yes, yeah, thanks, thanks Eva, thanks to all the working groups. Welcome, Minister Alfređsdóttir. We're happy to have you visit here. We understand that you have a very busy schedule, and we very much appreciate, with all that's going on, that you're able to take some time to share with us remarks on Iceland's perspective on the third Arctic Science Ministerial. Just as a brief introduction, Minister Lilja Alfređsdóttir is Iceland's Minister for Education, Science and Culture, also a former Minister for Foreign Affairs and External Trade. She's a member of Parliament, has a background in international economic policy, but she's also, through leadership of her ministry jointly with Japan, one of the leads for the third Arctic Science Ministerial to be held in Tokyo, Japan in November of this year. And so we very much appreciate to hear a bit more from you on Iceland's perspective on the third Arctic Science Ministerial, in particular in relation to how this might relate to the current meeting that's now coming to a conclusion. Minister.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a warm introductory remarks. I think it's extremely important that we continue with our cooperation, and despite of course the very, very challenging times that all our societies are facing right now. And in my view, it has never been as important that we focus on international cooperation as regards to science and research. I think with the current pandemic, that the key thing is that we have all our best scientists work together in order to address and find a cure. I don't think that we're going to be, that of course things have changed very dramatically within all our societies, but I don't think that we're going to, have a full international trade and open economies until that we basically find a solution to the current COVID-19 challenge. So that's why I think, and it's very important that we continue with our work, because the Arctic is of course still there. The Arctic is facing the same challenges as every other part in the world. We of course still have climate change, and we are firm in addressing everything as regards to that with the best scientific knowledge that we have at hand. And what we are of course focusing on is to bring the report from the Arctic Observing Summit to the Arctic Science Ministerial and integrate the feedback from its community into the joint statement. And I was very pleased to see the draft, the Arctic Observing Summit, and all the work that has been done. It's very impressive, because and I'm one of the things when we are going into the COVID-19 challenge, I always tell everyone here in the ministry, we've actually split up teams in order that if one team, if we would have the virus there, that the other team could work, etc. But it's very important that people are active and we keep ourselves as busy as possible in order to kind of see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I was pleased to see also kind of the Arctic response to COVID-19 for rural Arctic communities. There is obviously, because of the isolation, that it can be beneficial, but it can be extremely challenging if the virus is there, and I wouldn't be surprised that that it is somewhere there, as I see or not. And it focuses really on the strength of the healthcare systems there. So we are of course all family as regards to that. And in addition, I think that sharing resources for the global observing organization starting in the Arctic. I understand that the recommendation to launch these efforts in the Bering Sea region, because of its strong regional networks of indigenous observers, broadly international scientific activity, and major impacts from rapid environmental change. We think it's extremely important to build capacity as regards to food security and health and wellness for the Arctic residents, namely also because we can see what kind of a challenge the COVID-19 is presenting to all our societies. And we are very much focused here in Iceland, of course, on our food security, because we are an island and we are, of course, dependent on imports for a lot of our production. But fortunately, we have a lot of, very, secure food production in Iceland. But this is one of the things that we have been focusing on, and I think it's very important that we do that in Arctic context. I think one of the things that we need to jointly focus on is that we continue to focus and concentrate on science and scientific cooperation. There is no doubt in my mind that that's going to be the key as regards to development of and face the current challenge, and not only in science but also as regards to cooperation, as regards to health issues, and also how to secure our societies. So we are definitely kind of on the high road as regards to that. I basically thought it was very important that we would kind of have and hold this meeting, because we are focusing and preparing, of course, for ASM3 in Tokyo with our Japanese partners. And I want to thank all of you for your fantastic and ambitious input to the drafts and to the work that we have been doing. And of course, we are also here in Iceland extremely appreciative of the high participation in this work. And I think that's a token and a signaling of basically how important this international cooperation is in all of our countries. So basically, the intention is to bring these calls to action from AOS to the ASM3 planning process in our international network of policymakers engaged in the Arctic scientific research, and integrate these, of course, urgent issues that I touched up on briefly to the ASM3 joint statement. So once again, we highly appreciate all your extremely remarkable and valuable input to the work that we have been doing and in preparation for ASM3 in Tokyo. And I wanted also to conclude with taking questions and hopefully have good answers for these questions. So, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We appreciate the remarks. So I would encourage our online participants, which is basically all of us today, to enter any questions or comments into the Q&A box. And while you're doing that, Minister, I wanted to ask a question that might be a bit more challenging, but it would be good to get your sense on this. And that is that for us on the research end, we often see the type of policy work that you and your colleagues do as moving very deliberately and at a measured pace. And of course, with some of these challenges that we see now, such as COVID-19, there's a lot of rapid development. You know, you see that in the conclusions from and recommendations from the summit here, that we want to use this opportunity or want to look at COVID-19 not just as a threat, but also as an opportunity to rethink how can we better bring capacity at the community level in terms of sustaining observations that might be threatened by interruption. How can the Arctic Science Ministerial in the phase where preparations are underway now be responsive or nimble enough that some of those ideas get injected into the discussion? How much is a meeting like the Arctic Science Ministerial challenged in terms of responding more rapidly? Because of course, with a lot of science ministers attending, you need quite a bit of time to pre-negotiate and sort of review what people will actually be able to agree on. Do you see room for conclusions drawn amongst your group of colleagues that are responsive to very recent developments? And if so, what is it that we can do on the research community side or on the side of Arctic indigenous and Arctic communities to help with that?
So thank you very much for the question, and I think it's very much appropriate. I think what is very important is that we kind of keep our valuable cooperation going, and I think, you know, with the drafting and all the work that has been done is extremely valuable, and I see it as and I agree. I think that the scientific community of the world should, of course, everything is now under extreme stress in all our societies, but I think that there might be ways where we can use technology and we can use the research and the conclusions that are backed up with data in a more effective way. And I think one of the things that I can just share with you, the way that we are going into the COVID-19 challenge is that our epidemiologist, the Icelandic one, he is basically the chief commander, the commander-in-chief here in Iceland. Everything that basically all his recommendations to the Minister of Health are put into the cabinet, and it's based on the best scientific knowledge that we've had at hand. And we do a lot of testing here, and we use all our scientific community as much as we can, and very open to use the knowledge. And I think the same thing, of course, applies to the ASM3, is that I would recommend, because of more because we will be stressed as regards to time, and there are so many things that most ministers need to think about, and we will see instability everywhere. So I think my recommendation to you would be that drafting the concluding remarks would be extremely clear, and the object needs to be clear, and have it, you know, as simple as possible, but keep on going. And one of the things that I've always thought is extremely important, and and I wanna raise this here, is that for me, if you really wanna make a difference, and if you really wanna make awareness, let's bring it to the children. I mean, I think that has always been my focus, is that we would use the ASM3 also in order to raise awareness as regards to younger children, and raise awareness as regards to Arctic science. So I think that that still remains extremely appropriate.
Thank you. No, that's a very good point. And I do want to acknowledge that in particular, the indigenous participants, the community participants here at the summit have worked hard to incorporate youth and youth perspectives into their deliberations. So it's good to hear you say that. That's where maybe on the research side, we need to work a bit harder to have that full continuum from some of the children who may be facing even more grave threats here a couple of decades from now, have their voice be very clearly integrated into these types of efforts. We have one other question here that I just wanted to share from Catherine Boggs from Canada, who maybe is reflecting a bit more on what you already mentioned. That is, what specific advice do you have to the research community to improve the collaboration with policymakers? You know, I heard you say that, you know, be concise, be brief, and to the point is important. That's something we're definitely struggling with. And I see you're probably already editing our conference statement there, because it's still fairly long-winded. But anything beyond that, where you're saying, look, if you want to be sure that your research and sustained observations are useful, here's what you need to do with respect to policymakers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you again. First, on the point as regards to youth, I'm very happy to hear that that we're making specific efforts in order to include the youth. And just on a kind of a philosophical note, why I stress so much always children and youth, I think it's so important, especially with the current COVID challenge, is that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that there are some solutions, and basically the message that if you really, focus on an item and you really, put a lot of effort into what you're doing, you will see a result. You will see something come out of it. And then I'm going to connect it to the next question. What would be my specific advice to the scientific community? That is basically that the work that we feel that it is truly making a difference. I mean, let's rather aim for fewer things than more things, because then it's easier for us, the policymakers, to focus on it. So the more preparatory work, I mean, you can start with a very long list or some, good ideas, but, try to kind of make, especially now, to make it in such a way that we can really say, okay, we accomplished A, B, and C. And I think that that's something that could be, because currently, one of the reasons every policymaker now is focusing on the key challenge right now. But we all want to be, we all want to have something, to look forward to. And the AOS2020 is something that I personally look very much forward to it. And I want to have it as something that, kind of, keeps my mind also occupied. But in order for me to, be, that I feel kind of a good that I have invested in AOS2020, I kind of want to see that we will see something, something clear come out of it. And I'm very confident with the secretariat that we have here, both in Reykjavik and Tokyo. They're working extremely hard. And one of the things that I really, I'm happy about is the scientific community and the large ownership of the process, which I think is essential. If there's not like ownership of like the scientist, which is then transformed or transferred rather to the policymakers, nothing will come out of it. So I think basically kind of there needs to be a very solid bridge between what, the scientists and the officials are doing, and in order for it to be successful in the ministerial meeting. And this is of course always very, this is always the challenge. But I'm to a certain extent more optimistic, because the challenges are even greater than, they are greater now than 3 months ago, which kind of makes us all be more focused, because we want to ensure good participation. We're basically, I mean, our main goal is that we're going to have AOS2020, and that we will have full participation of all the ministers of science that we have invited. So we need to make certain that the material is extremely relevant, and just the concept of the importance of scientific cooperation is something that all ministers of science will, want to participate in, especially in light of COVID-19.
Great. No, thank you. That's very helpful. I hope we'll be able to take that to heart. I do just want to mention that we had a comment here from Melinda Chase, who's from Interior Alaska, who mentioned that one of the Interior Alaska Diné elders, Chief Trimble Gilbert, has also been pointing out, sort of reflecting on what you're saying here, has making the key point that it's important to bring along children and youth as you as you respond to change. If we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions, that would be great. I see another comment here from David Allen, who mentions that with the stress of COVID-19 and the financial measures that go along with it, it's likely that much science, which is often part of the discretionary budget in some of the countries, will additionally be stressed. So his question specifically is, how can the ministerial help to maintain a focus on improving Arctic research for the benefit of all?
Thank you for this question. One of the things, at least, I mean, I can just basically describe what's taking place here in Iceland, is that we are putting extra funds into R&D. We are boosting up our research as a result of COVID-19, because we are looking at unemployment numbers that we have never seen in the history of the Republic of Iceland, and we are very vulnerable as regards to exogenous shocks. So our basically answer to this is that we will invest to a greater extent in education and research, because we will there will be a lot of people that will be unemployed, and what we're focusing on now are the universities and vocational training, is that they are completely open to the ones both as regards to and focusing on innovation and research. And I'm hoping that more governments will do so, because we think that's kind of the things that will kind of keep people focused, something to look forward to, something that could potentially be creative. And we're also putting greater funds into the creative industries.
Thank you. Just one final question, maybe, since you served as Minister of Foreign Affairs as well. The Arctic historically is a region of strong international collaboration, regardless of individual policy perspectives in different countries. Do you see anything that the research community can do to, in particular at the present time, help maintain that spirit of collaboration and avoid us sliding into more segregated efforts in the Arctic and globally?
So what I think is very important, I'm always a great supporter of writing articles or communicate in whatever media, social media, whatever we have. So I encourage the science community is to communicate your research to greater extent that you've ever done before, because I think that's really something that we can be proud of. So I think last time when we had the Arctic Circle and I had a presentation, I was focusing on this as a policymaker and also a former Minister for Foreign Affairs, is that sometimes, because which I fully understand, is that because these are most of your work is of course of the extreme high quality as it should be, but in order to basically get greater focus on the work that we're doing, we need to be able to communicate it. And what I encourage everyone that are in this meeting is try to find ways in order to communicate the importance of the Arctic and Arctic science in the coming months in order to increase domestic and international interest.
Great, thank you. No, those are very, very helpful remarks. Minister, we thank you for your time. We very much appreciate that you came in, and we very much thank you for all the work that you do to help make ASM3 a success. Thanks.
Thank you also, and I highly appreciate all your participation, everyone that has been working towards making this event possible. I think it's extremely important that we keep on going and that we're focusing on science and international cooperation, because I think that's going to be the key to the solution of COVID-19. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Good. Well, with those remarks, we're now moving into the final section of the Arctic Observing Summit. And that is to give all of us here who are online an opportunity to get a brief glimpse and start asking some of the questions and provide initial perspectives on the joint AOS conference statement and call to action. So just a brief outline for up to an hour of time that we've set aside now. We'll first review, and I'll share with you on the screen the draft conference statement. So while I'm speaking, you should already be able to see that now. I'll be scrolling through this here in a minute. So we'll just touch on the key points of that, and then we'll open up the Q&A and comments for people to provide initial feedback. But I want to be clear that this is still a draft statement. We're hoping that this is going to be shortened somewhat, taking to heart some of the comments from Minister Alfređsdóttir.
Sorry to interrupt you, Hajo. Do you
yes.
think you could zoom in a little bit? The text is showing up pretty small on the screen share.
Yes, that is entirely doable. Let's see, how is that?
Doing better. If people want it even larger, please do put it in the chat, and we'll do what we can. Thanks.
Okay. And Kelly Ulick may be able to help with that. I see she's in the document now. So maybe Kelly, you could post parts of the document as we go through into the chat. So just a brief stepping back. So we'll do this here for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Then we'll look at next steps. What are some of the specific actions that we're hoping to take where we need this broader group that's present online here and beyond to be engaged. And then we'll close out the meetings. We're hoping to get a brief perspective from the SEAN chair, Sandy Starkweather, as well, because as you recall, the Arctic Observing Summit is a part of the SEAN universe and meant to help support important next steps. So that's what we have lined up here for the next hour or so. So let's just jump in and look at the statements. I want to acknowledge all the work that has been going into this document up until the last few minutes before our meeting today. So please keep in mind that this is a rough draft still. The timeline is that over the course of the next few days, the organizing committee, the working group leads are going to refine this further. I'm hoping that we can take the advice to heart to at least identify a very small number of key points that we would like to push forward at the Arctic Science Ministerial. This document essentially is the mechanism, or one key mechanism, for providing input from the observing perspective into the Arctic Science Ministerial. So let's just go through and we'll again entertain questions through the Q&A box as we go along. The first thing I did want to highlight here, you see this in the document, is that online participation has been strong. We've had over 350 participants registered from 28 countries. We're waiting on the final numbers, but we have had more than 40 indigenous experts that were part of the summit, as well as representatives of indigenous people's organizations. And the document that we're reviewing here now is a contribution to the Arctic Science Ministerial. So essentially, the way the AO's leadership has structured this document is that the first part of the document focuses specifically on the coronavirus pandemic, and we want to briefly review some of the key points raised here. So I'll come back to this in a minute, but then further down, we have a series of 4 very broad conclusions and calls to action, some of them echoing what you already heard in the first part of the of this final session. So I'll leave this up here for people to read on their own time and scroll through slowly. But the goal right now is not to have people provide advice on punctuation and grammar, but really see whether there are major issues that you have in terms of what we have missed. And again, this will not be at the level of you missed a potential essential variable that isn't called out by name, but it's really going to be focused more on what are the key aspects that we're trying to cover here. So a main conclusion from the deliberations in the different working groups and the cross-cutting sessions is that the COVID-19 crisis is a major threat to communities. This is very clearly developed in the text here. It's also a threat to continuity of important time series in the Arctic, because researchers may be prevented from accessing some important field sites, but at the same time, it also is an opportunity to use this year's field season to draw on the strengths of indigenous and Arctic remote communities in their ability to support and co-lead important aspects of the research activities going on, and to help provide a bit of a buffer in terms of continuity of important time series. But at the same time, and that's reflected in the text here as well, it's also an opportunity to better align some of the sustained observations with the information needs at the community level. And so what you see here is a number of specific calls to action, if you will. One of them highlighted here that came out of Working Group 3, and I would invite additional comments here in a minute from Working Group 3 if you want to add anything, specifically relates to the fact that a lot of Arctic research infrastructure can be, if it's not accessible because of travel restrictions, can be managed and supported at the community level. But at the same time, that research infrastructure is also an important resource potentially in responses to COVID-19 or other hazards or crises at the community level. And building out that connection more clearly is a key recommendation. That might require help from the Forum of Arctic Research Operators, who operate a lot of this large infrastructure. It may also require, in places where reassignment as far as possible of funding support is available, require input and thought from the Arctic Funders Forum, which has emerged out of recommendations from the past couple of observing summits and the Science Ministerial. And then finally, in this context, sorry, I'm just scanning through the comments here, so I see Kelly has posted this. Thank you, Kelly. And finally, the recognition that the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative, SEAN, can play a key role here, in particular by speeding up the process that they are defining and have outlined, the roadmap for Arctic observations and data systems, or ROADS, specifically by putting in place an expert panel on health and well-being that brings together indigenous scholars, community members, indigenous youth, health, social, natural scientists, and others with expertise on the health and well-being from different perspectives. So that's something that maybe Sandy Starkweather, who's going to share a few remarks with us here in a little while, can focus on as well. So maybe what I'd like to do is you see some of the text in the comments box here, so you can review that yourself. If there's any additions from any of the working groups, you know, our panelists here who want to add to the broader COVID-19 related recommendations, please chime in now. I would also then wait for any specific input through the Q&A box. And I would ask people, you know, you should be able to see the Q&A square at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please use the Q&A. It's a bit easier to keep track of than the Zoom webinar chat. So any additional points from any of our panelists or some of the working group leads who are in the among the attendees?
Hi, this is Margaret from Working Group 3. I guess I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on the inequity and the historical inequity with Indigenous groups, especially pertaining to COVID-19 and the historical 1918 flu epidemic that happened. And I am also happy the call for more Indigenous-led observing. That's certainly what we brought up, and also want to emphasize something from Working Group 2 is that it would probably help cut costs in the long term, and thinking of maybe rethinking about climate change adaptation and mitigation, and it'll be more representative of what these communities actually need.
Thank you, Margaret. Those are good points. In fact, based on what you just mentioned, I'm looking at, you brought up the efficiency factor there. I note that Colleen Strawhacker with the U.S. National Science Foundation just posted that the U.S. National Science Foundation, NSF, is accepting requests for rapid proposals that are proposals submitted in response to rapidly unfolding events. In response to COVID-19, she has shared the link in the chat box. This is something for US-based researchers to consider. It might be interesting for researchers in other countries, Canada, the European countries, Asia, to see whether there are similar channels. That's where the language, in particular once refined a bit more, of the Arctic Observing Summit may also help those researchers, communities, and others who are proposing to these opportunities to draw specific guidance on what appears to be most promising. I see there's another hand up here from Peter Schlosser.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly comment on the structure of that first part of the conference statement. And I think it, in general, in my view, it sets the tone by referring to the special moment that we are in, unfortunately a crisis. But it also, and that came out in the comments of the minister, that it uses that to look ahead so that we are not just stuck in it. So in a way we have to refer to it because it is something that we might see in the future again. We have to learn from it. We have to figure out what we have to observe right now that will help us to be better prepared and more resilient in the future. But we also have to then move on and see what kind of activities can come out of the analysis of this situation that would have a long-term effect. And so clearly there are aspects that can be added, the language can be changed, etc. But in my view, I think that it finds the right tone in general, and it has that balance of looking at what is happening right now, but then carrying it over into what that would mean for future action. We haven't gone yet to the second part. I think that's a little bit more work. That's a little bit more challenging to streamline, but I personally find that we have a good start into the conference statement within the paragraphs that have been shown.
Thanks, Peter. I see comments come in that are specific to wording, and we appreciate those, but just a brief reminder, I mean, this session is not meant to go into details of the wording. As mentioned, the document will be posted on the AOS website. We'll send out or we'll disseminate it via the email addresses that we have on file for those people who registered for the AOS. So again, if you haven't registered, I'd encourage you to do that now, because that's the only way we can communicate with participants. So that's where comments on the language specifically are important. I do want to highlight, though, one comment here, because, and this is both speaking internally and more broadly, you heard the minister bring this up. a long list, and long being anything longer than 3 key asks that comes from the observing community to the Arctic Science Ministerial likely will not nearly have as much of an impact as a very focused contribution. Let's keep in mind also that the Arctic observing stream is just one of 4 different connections from the research community, from the Arctic community into the Arctic Science Ministerial. So you have to imagine that whatever we as a group submit to the ministerial is one of 4, which really forces us to focus on the key issues. And there seems to be some consensus that thinking about a response to COVID-19 that takes the lessons from this and tries to implement as much improved networking and collaborative co-developed, co-managed efforts with respect to sustained observations, that has to be the prime focus. So we will have to find a way to winnow this down. And I noticed that again, Catherine Boggs here made a helpful comment to start the document with a 1-paragraph plain language executive summary. Very, very good. And that summary then will have to identify, at least by title, what are the 3 key things that are being asked for here. So with that, I don't know whether there's any other comments or input specifically on this section. I do want to note that so somebody was asking about the Arctic Funders Forum, and it's a good question, because one of the challenges that has been identified by the Arctic observing community, but also others, is the fact that it's very difficult to arrive at internationally coordinated and ideally commingled funding opportunities. The Belmont Forum would be one example. Some of you are familiar with that. That is a modest effort, but it's been very successful as a model from what we can tell. But the Arctic Funders Forum was specifically set up similar to the Forum of Arctic Research Operators here to deal with funding, with the challenges that come from trying to find mechanism to fund internationally coordinated observations. And so this brings back the comment made by Colleen Strawhacker, and that is that identifying funding opportunities that now have emerged through COVID-19 in the different countries and finding ways that research efforts can align is something that, at the very least, this joint statement here from the AOS can help initiate. You know, it can't drive those, but that's maybe something to discuss further under next steps. Okay, so let's do this. Let's move on now to the second part of the broader conclusions. So Kelly, if I could ask you to copy the text from these into the Zoom chat window so people can review that themselves. Again, this now is input from and partly combined from different working groups. The first section here introduces the concept of shared Arctic variables. And I understand there was a question from Hanne Sagen with the Intaros project in Europe, based out of Norway here earlier, that was getting at the question of do we expect to see a different definition, or shared Arctic variables fundamentally different from essential Arctic variables. And I think that's where the input from the working group 5, the links to global observations, is going to be important. But also, and that's where the current recommendations here are important, these types of questions, identifying shared variables, require a more detailed focus into the local and regional level. My sense was, and maybe Alice, I might be able to call on you again here to expand on this a bit, but my sense was that it's much more challenging to identify a meaningful shared Arctic variable at the Pan-Arctic scale, simply because a lot of the benefits, societal benefits derived from these variables play out at the local scale. And so the call here for a regional study or for a regional forum, we've identified the Bering and potentially Barents Sea here as areas to focus on, may help globally operating groups like GOOS and others get enough of a regional focus to clearly see how a shared Arctic variable concept would play out. Alice, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, you covered it pretty well. The idea here being that since we're dealing with multi-sector, multi-stakeholder environments, at some point we can't build the table big enough to have every single person and every single group that might be interested sitting around it. So if we can focus, if we can start some initial test cases with a more regional effort, where we're still getting the representatives of the different communities that we're looking for together, international, cross-sector, and collaborating between Indigenous communities and other sectors. We can start spinning up this process. We can start doing some of the learning at a scale that might be more tractable than trying to do the entire Arctic in one go.
Thanks, Alice. That's helpful. I do see another comment here that refers to the expert panels working under in collaboration with SEAN, who would define sort of the broader shared variables concept. This is by Lauren Devine, who was working with the Indigenous Food Security Working Group. And Lauren is asking what if Indigenous communities, Arctic communities, are not aware of or are not approving of the processes established by the global observing systems. And that's a very important question. In part, I'd like to put that off something for Sandy Starkweather to discuss as she talks about the broader SEAN umbrella. But in part also, I think it illustrates that you have to have this, a forum or a place where those who are impacted by Arctic change, who need observations from the local to the regional to the global scale to be able to respond, have to be sitting down in a round with those who are, either in person or virtually, with those who are providing the observations. And that's also where, if you look at the recommendations from Working Group 5, that's linking global to Arctic observing systems, where a lot of progress can be made and is entirely possible. I do want to ask whether any member of Working Group 5 would like to comment on this as well, how to ensure that the global observing frameworks are in fact meaningful, communicated clearly, and reflect input from the local level in the Arctic. Peter or Jan?
Yeah, so I can speak briefly to that. The way we envision that is that, of course, one should make use of what has been done in the global observing communities with respect to identifying and defining variables, and then also the standards by which they have to be measured and how they have to be archived, all that kind of stuff. We also recognize that this is not a simple transfer, but that there has to be a dialogue between those who are working on establishing the Arctic observing system with those who are operating and enhancing and further developing the global observing system, to address exactly these questions that that were raised. So it's not simply taking over what has been done in the global observing community, but making sure that to the extent that it fills some of the needs of the Arctic system, that it is taken in rather than being reinvented from scratch, but in a dialogue that leaves room to discuss the questions of acceptability, how appropriate are they, how are they technically fitting, how are they fitting the philosophy of a system, an observing system that cuts across all the sectors, and then certainly this question of what is a shared variable and things like that would come up in that dialogue too.
Great, thank you, Peter. So I'm reviewing some of the comments that come in here. I see that Hanna Sagen, who's involved quite a bit with goose-related work in Europe, agrees that the challenge we're just identifying here is a significant challenge because these clusters of variables depend on the types of services that are needed by the different users of the information. And so that's where more work has to be done. I'd like to move on sort of just, and you can review this on your own. I see people have already commented on some of the language again, and again, those comments are very valuable. We appreciate the specific suggestions on rewording, and that's something that really has to be collected as part of this document circulated in draft form. But if you look at the whole set of recommendations and conclusions here from the perspective of adapting to and mitigating rapid change in the Arctic, that does seem to align quite well with the comments made previously here, or with the conclusions from item number 1 with respect to shared variables. And that's again a question also for SEAN and the broader Arctic community, whether focusing our joint energies on clearly laying out these shared variable concepts may be a good use of our time, simply because the classic observing systems or observations of individual variables that do not have to be considered in context may not require the type of collaborative efforts that the Arctic Observing Summit and SEAN is trying to lead. So let's look at item number 3 here. These are coming out of working group 3, and again, I'll invite you to review this on your own time. Margaret Rudolph gave a really nice overview of these in her presentation earlier today, and again, there's a key the key points here are that the narrower single process focused approaches that are often driving key elements of observing systems do not well reflect the much broader perspective and use of information about the environment that indigenous communities take, ranging from the physical, biological to cultural and health and wellness components. So I don't see any specific questions on this section here, and then we have the final part of the document here, and that relates to the data group. And again, I would like to invite Peter Pulsifer to share any sort of specific points that he feels his group would like to raise. I think looking at the document here, knowing how well organized and how rigorous some of the work is that's been happening under the umbrella of data, federated data, and interoperability. I would challenge this group in particular to try to distill this into just a single, very specific ask that we can pass on to the Arctic Science Ministerial. Peter, do you want to add anything to that or comment on that? Peter Pulsifer.
Yeah, thanks, Hajo. Yeah, I hope that you can hear me. Thanks for that, and we'd be happy to do that. Our group met again this morning for 2 hours, so we developed from that what we provided to you last night. We can distill it down to a single ask, but then we'll also combine it with a more detailed report that will come out of this meeting that has the specifics, because many people in the community are thinking, you know, specifically what standards and protocols, how will we get this done? What do you recommend in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? So we're working on both levels, and we're happy to work with you and the overall committee on that.
Great, because I mean, and that's also an encouragement. Stephanie Russo-Carroll with the University of Arizona gave an outstanding plenary presentation that you can review on your own time. It's posted, the video of it is posted on the AOS conference website. She was also part of a panel, and it was interesting to see how much progress has been made in terms of, in particular, indigenous data management, community level data management, some of the things that may help, or looking at the data issue through that lens in particular may also help tie some of these points together better. So I would encourage that group. And of course, Peter, I know you're closely working with all of the key contributors there, but I'd encourage your group to just try to see whether you can weave a more closely connected link between the data and some of the other points raised here above. Good. So I would say, unless there's any urgent burning questions, again, this was just a review of the document as a whole, sort of a glimpse of the key points. The conference or the Observing Summit leads, working group leads, will have to work a bit more on winnowing this down some, tightening some of the key points, and making priorities very clear. Just as a reminder, there's a larger document that is in development that'll take, certainly a couple of months to put together, that includes all the work done in the individual working groups with much more specificity that will be publicly available. So the goal of the conference statement call to action is to highlight the small set of issues that need attention and provide specific guidance on what type of action is needed. And I think we're going to have to do a bit more work on that. So I think then we're ready to move into the final stretch here, and that is that we reflect on the meeting now and just ask ourselves, okay, what are the next steps here? Very specifically, with respect to the conference statement, the next step is that we'll have to further refine, clean this up, share this early next week. We'll allow for about a week until April 10 for people to submit comments, and those comments then can go into specific suggestions on wording, etc. And we will provide that information on how to access and submit access the documents, submit the comments by contacting you via email. So again, the key point is, for us, the only way to communicate with the broader AOS community is through email. So please register if you haven't done so. In the bigger picture, a key next step will be to further build out the linkages with the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative under the Arctic Council and the International Arctic Science Committee. And so I would like to turn to Sandy Starkweather, who's the chair of SAON, leads the SAON board, to maybe just give us a brief perspective on where you, Sandy, see the roads process and some of the committee work that's happening under SEAN tie into what has come out of this summit.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks, Hajo, for the opportunity to reflect on this, and really a big thanks to the leaders of the Arctic Observing Summit and the working group leads and all of you for bringing the SEAN roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems so directly into this dialogue. I think it's been very impactful and has certainly given us a lot of good feedback with which to revisit what we've already kind of committed in terms of defining the process, but also super helpful for just the learning opportunity to be able to engage a broader group of people into this development. And I think it really reflects the kind of shared mutual vision between these two organizations, and for sure a huge congratulations to Iceland and the XCOM for the tremendous push to make this meeting so successful on such short notice. So you know, just in reflection on this partnership and roads and where we go next. So SEAN's strengths are certainly its formal mandates, its governance structure, and its strong partnerships. Its role as a regional facilitator. And I think from what we heard this week, it's timely for SEAN to renew engagement in its board under the value proposition of the roads process, and particularly recognizing that each of the Arctic Council permanent participants and each of the Arctic Council working groups are entitled to seats on the board, but we haven't had that strength of participation that we need, and I think we need it now more than ever. And by contrast, AOS's strength is really this convening power. We've had the intellectual capacity of 350 participants at the summit, working across knowledge systems, you know, an incredible intellectual capacity, and that's all really going to help us build a stronger roads process. And I think that roads kind of exemplifies where we're going to partner on the road ahead. What we heard reflected in the deliberations was, I think, a broad enthusiasm for the process as it represents this means to organize the acknowledged complexity of the Arctic system of systems and the diversity of perspectives. We need to move towards that unified voice. I think that was broadly recognized, and areas where we can improve the process and improve our articulation of the process, and in particularly where we can get started right away. Some of the things we heard, that there was a tremendous amount of interest in these expert panels, and I think that's great because that's where so many people who participate in the summit are, we hope, eventually going to end up across that wide range of expertise, range of knowledge systems, range of practices, that we want the panels to be inclusive. But we also heard that for capacity issues in especially Indigenous organizations and Indigenous communities, we really need to think about funding and how we can help build capacity through using the roads process and its definitions in proposal-driven efforts to support funding. But also in light of the capacity issues, we also heard a renewed call to kind of pace ourselves. And I think that concept of pacing ourselves is really well aligned with the minister's comments to aim for fewer things than more things. You know, relating to Lauren's comments about this interface between the global networks and local and regional context and needs, I think it's correct that we should be led by the local and regional needs in our maybe review or evaluation of the progress that the global networks have made. A really good building point for this is what we've seen and heard from Interos and the Copernicus project, where they've already filtered down a great many of the global essential variables to a shorter list of those that they feel will be most impactful and where most progress can be made. So I think we can view these as starting points, but that the decision making really needs to be driven by local and regional needs. And I think that's why we say essential Arctic variables is it's a reflection of the need for that the shared values at the local and regional scale. And again, I think in speaking of things we heard from the summit, this concept of renaming them to be shared Arctic variables, I think is really compelling. So, you know, we heard a lot about the expert panels. I'd also like to remind people that SAON's proposed an advisory panel. And the advisory panel, I think, can really, especially, you know, if we build it and the proper engagement into the advisory panel, it can really serve to play the role of that guide on local and regional needs. On essential Arctic variables or shared Arctic variables, again, underscoring aim for fewer things than more things. And that aim, I think, should certainly be guided by the urgency of the present moment, in addition to building on the progress that we've seen made by efforts like Interos. I think the very compelling suggestion about getting urgently to work on a panel that will speak to health and well-being. You know, what was interesting to learn is that this had already been in the forefront of the discussions of the Indigenous Food Security Working Group even before the pandemic was declared a pandemic. So it's clearly a reflection of a high priority that can be built from. So I won't say more. I mean, we definitely heard a lot about what we should be considering under the essential Arctic variables, and critically what we really wanted to hear and we heard a lot on was what the criteria should be. And so we have a good amount of information to distill and reflect back there. I'd like to reiterate that we hope that one of the purposes that the roads structures and elements can support is funded and proposed proposal-driven efforts. Sorry, stumbling on my words. We hope that you in this community recognize some of the avenues that you might use existing funding opportunities to support capacity building and to support expert panel efforts. And reflecting more broadly on the role that SAON can play in the year ahead, you know, we're facing a crisis. And there's a great quote by Rahm Emanuel that you shouldn't waste a good crisis. And that really reminds us to focus on opportunities even as we're dealing with the stress and trauma of a crisis. And we heard a lot here about how this could really promise an overturning in practices for field science, innovative solutions and partnerships with Northern residents. And I think also the action items that we saw Margaret outline, things that SAON can take up more urgently related to its atlas, both updating and renaming its atlas. The Atlas of Community-Driven Research and Monitoring is what was proposed. So the SAON board meets next week, and we're gonna take the opportunity to prioritize these urgent action items in our deliberation. And so, you know, just final reflection, I see great opportunities for SAON and AOS to co-evolve and to use roads as sort of an ongoing structure for our partnership. But I also want to emphasize that while this is a planning process, that we have to emphasize on a planning process that will support urgent action and not slow it. And so we need the roads process to be agile. We need it to be easy to understand and easy to engage with. And again, referring back to Minister Alfređsdóttir's comments, the objects should be clear. The object of roads should be clear, and in particular, how we think about conveying our needs through the roads process and the results of the roads process to the Arctic Science Ministerial. So thanks for an opportunity for these reflections, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Great, thank you, Sandy. If there's any immediate questions, I see there were some comments typed in the comment box here. One from Michael Tjernström from Sweden. He was one of the panelists earlier this week in a panel organized by Molly McCammon. And Michael just highlights the fact that for the past decade, quite a bit of effort has gone into pointing out the importance of the Arctic in the global context, whether it's links through weather systems, extreme weather, a range of other processes, all the way from the physics to the social environmental, and it's important not to forget about the importance of observing in that context. That's a really important point. I think the sort of the spirit of the Arctic Observing Summit, my sense is, as well as in particular of SAON, is to say we want to find mechanisms so that observations in the Arctic address the global information needs. That's why there's such a big interest of non-Arctic countries in Arctic processes as well. But in doing so, whatever needs to be done to also ensure that those observations that have value at the community level deliver on that value, and that at the local level, there's a process in place to help guide the observing system from the bottom up. I think that's kind of the key challenge. But my sense is that at the summit, there's been quite a bit of progress because people have been very, very much engaged. I don't know whether there's any other questions. I would say, looking at the clock as well here, that it's time to move on and move towards the sort of the final set of comments here. So the thing to keep in mind is that we're hoping, as part of the organizing committee, that those of you who've been part of the meeting here just had a little bit of a glimpse, or some of you, for all we know, might be looking at this closing session weeks or even months later, because all of this, thanks to our Icelandic hosts, is being preserved at the IASK YouTube channel, as well as in the AOS website that the team here at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks has set up. So you have the ability to later on review a lot of this material. We want you to stay engaged, and the AOS Secretariat that's led out of the Arctic Institute of North America, University of Calgary, Mary Beth Murray, and here out of International Arctic Research Center is going to work with the different working groups to provide some type of communication and support structure to allow us to move on and actually start working on the issues that have been identified here during the summit. So before I close out with just a last few comments on thanks and a few sort of key items, I just wanted to ask Peter Schlosser, as the one of the co-leads of the executive committee here and the chair of the International Study of Arctic Change, to just give us a broader perspective here at the end of the AOS.
Thank you, Hajo. It was an interesting summit, very different than the ones that we had before due to the crisis that all of a sudden we were faced with. But I think moving it to a virtual meeting was a heroic effort, but it actually worked really well. So this was something that I was actually really pleased to see how seamless that transition worked, and clearly would like to thank everybody who was involved in that, the local organizers, but also members of the organizing committee. Sort of looking at the situation that we are in and how that fits into the considerations and the thoughts about Arctic observing, I thought that the Observing Summit did a good job in recognizing that there is a special moment in time that has to be addressed now, that also will have implications for how we are looking at Arctic observing in the future. And a lot has been said about that, so I will not list all the items that fall underneath that, but clearly one of them is a different level of participation of the individual contributors to the Arctic observing system, especially those who are located in the Arctic, indigenous communities and remote communities. So that is where I think we will probably see a lasting impact of this present crisis. And there are others that have been mentioned, so I'm not repeating them. It was also gratifying to see that with that effort on focusing on the present situation and what it means for the future of observing, that we did not lose the thought process that had been started decades ago about what are the fundamentals that we need, what kind of system do we need, how does that system really differ from the global systems, and how can we make sure that we get a better interaction and more synergies between the cross-domain Arctic observing system and the mostly single domain global observing system. So I think a lot of progress has been made in thinking about how this could work, what can be gained on both ends actually. I don't see that as a one-way street where the Arctic community learns from the global or vice versa, but it really goes in both directions. And the issues of the value that the global observing systems can bring to the Arctic observing system through evaluating what is an essential variable, no matter how we call it, if it's an essential Arctic variable or a shared Arctic variable, that there is clearly something that has been done that we can build upon. We also have highlighted, which I think is important, that there has to be a dialogue between these two communities at a more extensive level than we had in the past. Also has been mentioned, and I think that's an important point, that since a long time we have thought about the implications of the Arctic for the global system and what that means for what has to be observed in the Arctic and how we are actually relating that back into the global system. So overall, I thought that the scope of the summit was actually broader than we originally had thought due to the outbreak of COVID-19. But I think it was actually well accommodated in the discussions throughout the working groups, throughout the panels, the keynotes, the plenaries. And from that perspective, I think this was a success. I also want to remind everybody that the summits are typically highlights in a process, and that process becomes more extensive, has become more extensive over the years, and it continues through working groups, now the Rhodes process, between the summits. So as we are moving forward, it would be great if many of you would stay engaged, and we will see how many of the working groups might become almost like standing working groups. That's something that has to be thought through, but working group 1 is almost at that point, or one could say is at that point. Some of the others might follow for like data is also something that is in essence a standing working group that works between the summits. So that's something that I would like to bring to attention, that there is an opportunity to participate in thinking through how the Arctic services should look like, how it's implemented, where the resources are coming from, and how we define it better between the summits. And so all that I think worked out pretty well. Final comment on my side or observation is that it's always this tricky exercise that we have to go through towards the end of these deliberations, and that is to boil everything down into a few recommendations that we heard at number 3 from the minister, and we always also had that sort of swirling around in our mind from a lot of good thoughts. So these other good thoughts will not get lost, and the recommendations, the 3 that will go into the document that will inform the Arctic Science Ministerial will of course try very hard to capture something that has some dimensions within them, but still are fairly concise and can be seen in the context, as Hajo reminded us, of the other 3 streams of the Arctic Science Ministerial, because there are 4 altogether. So while this is being done, while it had to be pared down, while you might not see your very specific contribution in the final document, they will not be lost. The more extensive report that goes to SEON, goes out to the communities, will capture these other dimensions, and there will be ways to consider how to implement them. But if we can get 3 asks formulated, and if 2 of them would be implemented, I think that already would be through support by the ASM3, that already would be a great success. So overall, again, I would like to thank everybody who is online right now, everybody in the working groups, the leads of the working groups, everybody in the organizing committee, and especially those on the ground who really had a major challenge to pivot from welcoming many hundreds of guests to something that had to be fine-tuned and delivered on a very short period of time. And I think to the extent that I can judge, and I'm on many virtual conferences right now, this was a heroic effort with an absolute success. So thanks to everybody, and thanks Hajo for the opportunity to give these remarks.
Thank you, Peter. So before we close out completely, I do want to acknowledge and offer an opportunity. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I see that we have some of the lead organizers of the Arctic Science Ministerial from Japan on this meeting as well. I see Takuji Nakamura, Director of the National Institute of Polar Research in Japan, is on, Hiroyuki Inamoto, who's one of the leads, as well as Tetsuo Tsuyoshi. I just wanted to give one of you an opportunity to just very briefly extend a perspective from the ASM3 organizing committee. And if any of you want to chime in, please let us know through the chat box, and then Ellen Pope can bring you into the meeting so you can share brief remarks by addressing all of the participants. If not, of course, we're all looking forward to...
Hajo, Tetsuo is unmuted and should be able to speak now.
Yes, Tetsuo, please go ahead. Tetsuo Tsuyoshi, who's a member of the ASM3 organizing group from Japan.
Thank you, Hajo. So we as a ASM3 organizers would like to thank you very much for this effort during this AOS. So transform it to the online form, and they created this very good statement from the conference. So we are very impressed with the how well this statement is now drafted, and we are very happy to see this action-oriented statement, which will be very useful for us to create a joint statement of the ministerial meeting and our science summary from that. So we are all very happy, and thank you very much for this effort. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tetsuo. So then just one other item. Peter already mentioned this. On the one hand, the transition to online worked well, but we did hear from several people, both in the meeting today and earlier, that of course, moving to an online format is a major challenge, in particular for Indigenous participants from Arctic communities, many of them remote, a lot of offices that often have the only broadband internet access in those communities were closed because of COVID-19, a lot of challenges. I want to acknowledge in particular participants from these remote communities throughout the Arctic who have done a fantastic job in overcoming all of these challenges and staying engaged and very much raising the level of discourse at the summit. So this really is an illustration both of the challenges that these Arctic communities face, but also an impressive demonstration of how these can be overcome. But as you see in the summit statement, that will require further work to enhance capacity to engage. So finally, then, I just wanted to mention that you will be receiving, again, you have to register if you want to, a survey that will be sent out through the Icelandic organizers, Alan Pope, and then here, Heather McFarland at IARC. That survey will help us see what aspects of the current format with the online summit were good that you feel we should actually retain, and maybe entertain the idea of having an online-only summit in intermittent years, or other suggestions on how to improve the overall summit process. So please look for that. That's important. Finally, I would like to more specifically thank a few people, in particular on the part of the Icelandic organizers, University of Akureyri and Ranis, Alan Pope, Federica Scarpa, and Thorstein Gunnarsson were absolutely the greatest crew to work with and make this happen. Again, Peter already alluded to this. If you've ever organized a large meeting like this and you know you've got everything in place to welcome all the participants, hundreds of them in your hometown, and then you see that fall to pieces, and out of those pieces you build something as great as what they have done, that's fantastic, and we owe them all a really big round of thanks. I do want to also highlight Arctic Institute of North America, Maribeth Murray, and in particular Ravi Sankar, who's been supporting and streamlining and thinking 3 steps ahead in terms of summit preparation over the course of the past year, during which the executive committee has been engaged. All the members of the executive committee, as well as the working group leads, I'd like to thank. And I also would like to thank the team here at the International Arctic Research Center, Heather McFarland, Tina Buxbaum, Mike DeLue, Gabriel Vance, who in a matter of just a few weeks helped us transition to this online format, which given the circumstances, I feel was about as good as we could expect. So with that, the next AOS will be, if we stick to our current schedule, which we will, alternating years, will be in 2022 as part of Arctic Science Summit Week. But in the meantime, please continue to stay engaged in the working groups. We may have, because that was one of the suggestions that came up, we may have an opportunity to also meet online or at a more regional scale next year. And I just see here, I should have been thanking Carolyn Rosner here with the IARC team as well for outstanding web design that allowed you to interact and use the website effectively. So with those thanks, have a great evening or a great day wherever you are. Thanks for your engagement. Let's continue collaborating jointly on these important issues. Thank you and goodbye.